Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this final session of the Royal Statistical Society Conference, and of course welcome to those GSS conference delegates who are joining us for this joint plenary session. My name is Brian Tarrant, I'm the editor of Significance magazine, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Dame Anne Glover as our Significance lecturer. Professor Glover has a BSc in biochemistry from Edinburgh and a PhD in molecular microbiology from Cambridge. Her research interests include studying how our proteins are directed to the replication within our cells, the diversity and function of the microbial population in soil, the development of biosensors to detect environmental pollution, and more recently, how we respond to stress at the molecular level. Now, these are all fascinating and important areas of work, of course, but the reason we invited Professor Glover here today was to talk about one particular strand of her career. That's Professor Glover's work to bridge the gap between science and policy. So Professor Glover was the first chief scientific advisor to the President of the European Commission, and that was from 2012 to 2015. And prior to that, from 2006 to 2011, she was the first chief scientific advisor for Scotland. Her lecture today is largely based on those experiences. So Professor Glover will discuss the role of science and evidence in policy making, the value of collaboration and clear communication, and the vital importance of statistical education. Her talk is titled Lost in Translation, the Importance of Being Understood. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Dame Anne Glover.
Brian, thank you very much, and thank you indeed for inviting me to give this significance lecture. It's always comforting to know that your lecture has at least got significance somewhere in the title. So I hope what I'm going to say will be of interest to you, because as Brian described, I think it will be clear that I'm not a statistician, although my boss at the University of Aberdeen, our Vice-Chancellor, is a statistician, and when it was announced I was going to give this lecture, he embarrassed me in our senior management meeting by saying he had something terribly important to tell everyone, and that was that I was going to give a talk at the RSS, and it was like, obviously made his day, so made mine too, thanks very much. I want to talk to you about the use of evidence. And it is important because what we all do in my entire research career, what I've been doing is generating knowledge. And by and large, I've done that at the cost of the taxpayer, with a few exceptions. And I think that the taxpayer deserves the value of the knowledge that I've generated. So I've always felt a very strong obligation to communicate in the research that I do, to say why it's important, how the knowledge can be used, and not just in terms of translating it so it might have an impact on the economy, or it might be just intellectually very stimulating. But the important bit about policy, about getting governments to look at evidence prior to implementing policy, because we're all affected by policy. So I'm going to use examples in the twilight life that I've had in the last 10 years or so, working very closely with government, first in Scottish government, which was really my first introduction to how governments operate, and Scottish government isn't much different from any other one, and then at the European Commission, which is not exactly a government, but there is a political flavour to the European Commission. So it's like the civil service of the UK government, but there is a political overtone to the activities there. And of course, all of us are affected by EU policy and regulation. So I'm going to give you some examples of things that worked, things that didn't work. But the most important message that came to me over those 10 years was that if you can't communicate, and if you don't take time to communicate, you really shouldn't even bother doing the research or generating the knowledge in the first place. To me, it's the most crucially important thing. So hence the title Lost in Translation. And it's also the title of one of my favourite films. I don't know how many people have seen this, with Scarlett Johansson and Bill Murray, Lost in Translation, where they weren't really communicating very well. And there was all sorts of tensions arose because of that. If you haven't seen it, get the DVD, have a look at it. Really good film. So here's another example of Lost in Translation in many ways, and this is whilst I was working as the Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission, who was then José Manuel Barroso. And he is a man, not a scientist by background, but somebody who was actually really quite passionate about science. So he was a workaholic, he worked all the time, and for fun, relaxation for him would be getting... He's in the room. Relaxation for him would be getting a copy of New Scientist and having a look through and seeing what was being done. He really was interested and had some science in his family as well. So, particularly when working with him, because if you like, I had an open set of ears who wanted to listen, but it became clearer and clearer, particularly working in the European Commission, that the translation of knowledge through something meaningful, statisticians come in here, so that it's valuable to be used at the sharp end, which is in policy making and implementation of regulation, directive, legislation, and so on, that it wasn't as straightforward as I thought. And perhaps I was a little naive. But what I want to do is to talk about a little bit about the evidence. Where's the evidence base? How do we procure it? What's credible evidence? Because there's lots of evidence, not all of it is credible. How do we deal with uncertainty? And again, I would say this is where we're heavily reliant on sophisticated communication from statisticians. And when I say sophisticated, I almost mean the opposite of that. It's demystifying the information so that it's actually valuable and persuasive. We can also misuse evidence, and that can be done quite badly. I'll give you examples of these and what the consequences are of misuse. Okay, so first of all, we're in Europe at the moment. Well, we'll always be in Europe, not always in the European Union, I guess. And one thing that we can be terribly proud of, certainly I am, I can't get over this, that if you take the European Union, in terms of science, engineering, and technology, we're #1 in the world. In not just one single area, but right across the piece, whether it's in oceanography, nanotechnology, which is a nice place to speak about it in Manchester, alternative energy, neuroscience, space technology, aviation, transport technology, alternative fuels, you name it, my own area of molecular biology and biosensors. So in all of these areas, we excel. So something to be proud of, which is a good thing. And we're also rather modest about this. That I quite like about something, not everything can be called a European characteristic, but actually we are saying, oh yeah, we're not bad. No, we're really good. So something we could be genuinely pleased about. And one of the reasons is that we have fantastic infrastructure. Infrastructure that we share, so we don't keep it to ourselves. Anyone in the world can use it. This is one of the most memorable visits that I had. Actually, I say visit. When you're in academia, we used to go on trips. When I went to Scottish Government and said I was going on a trip, they said, we don't go on trips, we go on visits. So I thought, fine, I went to the European Commission and I said, so I'm going to go on a visit. And they said, we don't go on visits, we go on missions. So this is a mission, a European mission to the very large telescope at Paranal in the Atacama Desert. An absolutely astounding place to be. I won't ever forget it. And this wonderful technology that we make to look at the universe, and it's quite stunning, and the people I met there, incredibly enthusiastic and inspiring people. The only thing that's not inspiring is how they name their equipment. So this is a very large telescope. They're building another one. It's 25 kilometers away as the crow flies from Paranal. It's even bigger. Any guesses? It's the extremely large telescope, the ELT. So the ELT, they've broken ground, they're cutting the top off the mountain, and they're building it as we speak, which is terrific. So with all of this, we generate knowledge, and we use that knowledge or evidence to tackle global challenges in a rational way. So if we have infectious diseases, if we have aging populations, if we need sustainable energy sources, if we have natural hazards and disasters, famine, food instability, in all of these areas, we need to generate knowledge to understand how we might combat, both understand initially and then combat these issues. So it's a very, very important and powerful thing. Nothing on our planet will work without knowledge and evidence. But not all evidence is credible, and I thought I would just show you an example here. On the left, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a US senator. He was from Irish extraction and went and lived in the States and became a senator. And there is one quote attributed to him that I like very much, and that is that we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. And I think that that's worthwhile remembering what the difference is between opinion and facts. And here's an example of Mohammed Al-Fayed after the death of his son Dodi and Diana, Princess of Wales. And he had the strong opinion that they were murdered, or that Diana was murdered. And here is a piece of evidence that he's showing, and that is that he went out and asked all of you. You're not a typical audience, so actually I'm not sure we would get the same result or any result if I asked you this same question: was Diana murdered? But 85% of the people that were polled on his behalf said yes, and he said, there it is, that's a fact then, that she was murdered. But this is not credible evidence because it's opinion. It is not underpinned by fact. And just in case you don't know, the Courier and Advertiser is a popular northeast paper based in Dundee. So credible evidence does matter. And one thing that makes evidence credible, I suppose, is the source of that evidence. So I want to give you an example of where evidence was, or something was found. This is the Shroud of Turin, which was in the late 80s, early 90s. This artifact was discovered, and people said, well, you just need to look at it. You can see the imprint here of Jesus, and this was the shroud that was used to wrap him, and you can clearly see his face there. So this was an astonishing discovery. But we can use science, and in this case, in a number of laboratories in the US and Arizona, in the UK and Oxford, and in Switzerland and Zurich, small samples of the shroud were taken, and different techniques were used in order to date the material of the shroud. And it was shown to be medieval, so 13th, 14th century at the very oldest. And therefore, that really would be a miracle, wouldn't it, if 13th, 14th century material had been used as the shroud for Jesus. So we have methodologies that allow us to explore evidence to determine whether or not we think it is credible. So that's our starting point for credibility. But trust is also important. So it really matters who's telling you the evidence. And I thought you might be interested in this, which is a recent Ipsos Mori poll in 2015, just looking at who are the most trusted people in the UK. So doctors generally are the most trusted. So if your doctor tells you to lose weight, stop smoking, drink less alcohol, you should trust her or him. They're telling you the truth. Teachers also a high level of trust, as do judges, and scientists. So we're up there amongst the profession who are trusted. Now, I know there's some government scientists here, so I thought I would just burst your bubble a little bit to say that academic scientists are highly trusted. Government scientists are trusted a little bit less. Still not, you're not at the bottom of the pile, but less. Just to put some perspective on this, hairdressers are also really trusted, only 10% less trusted than we are. I have to say, I don't trust my hairdresser one bit, but it's interesting that you can probably understand why. But anyway, just to look at all of this, and this is rather busy and complicated, and I know you're not going to be seeing all this, but we got down to our scientists here. If you're interested in the change, this is going from 2014, so just a one-year change, really. So we're, in 1 year, became slightly less trusted. Hairdressers, the police, blah, 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 blah. But remember Mohammed Al-Fayed there with his people. It was reported in the newspaper that journalists reported that Diana had been murdered. Well, if we go down and have a look, journalists are not trusted. So these are the percentage of people or level of trust in journalism. Now, I know sometimes we laugh at this, but for me this is very, very serious, that we don't trust journalists for a reason that I'm going to go on and develop more. But very sadly, right at the bottom of the pile are government ministers and politicians generally. Now, why that is so dangerous is that these are the people that we elect to represent our interests, and yet when asked we say we don't trust them. So there is something fundamentally wrong and I think deeply troubling about our democratic system, at least in the UK, where we have so little trust in the people that we elect to represent us. And I think if we don't do something about this, our society will end up getting worse and worse and more unstable. That's my opinion. So, how does society get its evidence? Well, here are some examples of where people get evidence. And for any of you who got on a train or an airplane to come here, you get free newspapers. It's often the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or whatever that you get. And people sit and read this. And I'm always astonished because, frankly, I would rather never read again than read the Daily Mail, but that's my view. And so there is no way that I would ever be seen even touching a copy. However, maybe that's a bit extreme, but here's an example of what the public hear. Now, the public tell us that they don't believe journalists, and yet how many times have you or I, or we've seen this on television in commentaries where people tell us that suicides are linked to mobile phone masts, that global warming isn't happening because it was very cold winter a couple of winters ago. Nonsense that we hear, often, at least for the past 20 years, linked to EU regulation about bent bananas or no salt in chip shops or whatever, which are just complete myths, but reported in newspapers. And I'll say something about this one, because in 2014, when Romania became part of the EU, it meant that they were then able to travel freely throughout the EU. And we were told that flights were sold out, buses full, as Romanians headed for the UK. On the 1st of January, there was one Romanian who arrived at Heathrow. One Romanian, and he had a job to go to. In the first 2 months, 10 Romanians came to the UK. And this is data from the Romanian embassy, who have to gather the data for their nationals coming to the UK. So if we don't trust journalists, but yet people just absorb, the population at large absorb this, and they do it in rather a vacuum, because nonsense like this, in my mind, is not generally challenged. Okay, so coming on to harder evidence and talking about how we might challenge and how we might communicate evidence and what we do, I thought, because I'm mindful of my audience, the interpretation of evidence is really, really important. And it's often where we make a mistake, that we interpret it or talk about it to other professional scientists, whatever discipline they might be in, but we don't take the trouble to translate it for the non-scientist or the non-expert. So if we just have a look at on the left-hand side, and I'm sorry if you can't see this in detail, but let me just take one example. On the bottom, we're looking at the hazard, exposure to all sorts of environmental pollutants and lifestyle factors can often lead to cancer. And on the top of the line is public outrage. So how worried are people about cancer? Not so much, compared to 1 in 3 of us will get cancer during our lifetime. So maybe we should be a little more mindful of the causes of cancer. Similarly, car accidents. Just out of interest, a bit of fun really, would you put your hand up if you think you're an above average driver? Yeah, smart audience. Okay, so I mean, obviously, if I generally ask that same question to an audience, not with your discipline persuasion, there's normally about 75 to 85% of people think, from me eyeballing it, that they are an above average driver. Driving is very dangerous, either for injury or death. And yet very few people are worried about it. They're, in contrast, rather worried about electrosmog. And I'm not even sure I can explain to you what that is, but they're worried about it. So you can see that what we desperately need is we need some way to translate evidence, risk, hazard, all of these things into something that's meaningful, not just for the public, but also for the policymaker. Similarly, if I look at the right-hand side, so this is energy generation, and at the bottom of this line is, people don't mind at all about this, and at the top of the line, people are very worried about it. So people like hydropower, they don't like nuclear power. Below the line are the number of estimated deaths per terawatt hour generated, and above the line are the percentage is the amount that we use of this particular energy in production. And you can see that, again, perception is completely different from reality, although risks, this is where it gets very interesting, I guess, for you to look at this, because although we might see very few deaths, what we have to look at is risk and consequence. And that might be quite different if something went wrong during nuclear power generation compared to something going wrong during hydropower generation. So it is a difficult task to communicate. But if you don't do it, really, if you don't do it, who will do it? There is nobody better qualified. So here's the really difficult problem, and this is one of the issues that came up time and time again whilst I was particularly at the European Commission. And this is the problem. So if you look at the probability of something happening from low to high against the impact of if it does happen, how big of an impact is it going to have from low to high, then if you've got something which is low probability and it'll have low impact anyway, you really don't need to worry about it. And similarly, if it's got a high probability and a high impact, then yeah, we'll deal with it. But what is extraordinarily hard for policymakers to deal with is something which might have a low probability, but really a very significant or high impact. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is endocrine disrupting chemicals. So there are a number of plasticizers and chemicals such as that, which are known to potentially disrupt endocrine systems. And, you know, frankly, at my stage of life, that might be possibly vaguely unpleasant if I was affected by endocrine disruptors. But if I was a young woman, if I was pregnant, and my fetus was affected by an endocrine disrupting chemical, the impact would be quite catastrophic for that fetus and everyone associated with it. So impacts can be very high, and they can also be very politically sensitive, because a newt becoming extinct is not going to bring down a political career, but a significant number, and that can be simply 5 or 10 in a population of fetuses aborting or having hormonal problems or whatever because of these chemicals, that becomes a major political risk as well as a human risk. And it is inordinately hard to deal with these issues. So another example whilst I was at the Commission was the Commission decided to ban the use of neonicotinoid pesticides in agriculture for 2 years because there was some evidence, not convincing, you know, so people were not absolutely clear that the evidence was watertight or they had a high degree of confidence, but some evidence that neonicotinoids were affecting pollinators such as bees and that bee populations were declining. So indeed, the population of bees was declining, but the question was it the neonicotinoids alone? Was it in a mixture with other things? Was there something else completely that was much more significant than any chemical factors? But because there was a very strong lobby, politicians felt inclined, although they felt that there was perhaps a low probability, but the impact could be very high if indeed we were destroying a pollinator population. But a recent study by Newcastle University determined that this temporary 2-year ban of neonicotinoids has cost UK farming £22 million a year on average because of crop loss of not using the neonicotinoids. And interestingly, they're still collating information about bee health, but it appears that there is not as strong a correlation between neonicotinoids and bee health as was previously thought. So, how do we combat people's perceptions or using gut feelings in order to pursue particular policies? And one way we can do that is to use scientific evidence. It's sound, it's peer-reviewed. That doesn't mean to say it's perfect, but it is at least reviewed and examined and interrogated. And evidence does evolve over time, and we shouldn't pretend that it doesn't. But it doesn't generally change from one government to the next. And that was one of the reasons that in both the Chief Scientific Advisor roles I held, right at the very beginning, in speaking to my potential future employer, I suppose, was to say that I had to be referred to as an independent Chief Scientific Advisor. In Scottish Government, that was accepted very quickly. President Barroso put up a bit of a fight, I have to say, and said, but you can't be independent. If you work for the Commission, you're a Commission employee, end of story. But I was trying to explain to him that science is independent, and if there was any suggestion that the evidence that I spoke about was only that selective evidence that was supportive of Commission policy, then there was no point in even paying my salary. And so we agreed that I could call myself independent and he would call me an independent chief scientific advisor. With the proviso, he said, I don't want you ever to embarrass me. Well, I think I said I would try never to embarrass him. You'd have to ask him if he felt embarrassed or not at the end of my time there. What happens if you don't use evidence, or if you just don't go out and seek it, procure it in the first place? It doesn't exist. And here's an example. This is the Aral Sea, which is one of the biggest freshwater bodies of fresh water on our planet. And in the 60s, so that this is actually a picture from 2000, but in the 60s it covered almost the entire slide that you see, sustained huge populations of people who were fishing and using agriculture on the margins of the lake and so on. And then over the years, if we look, so 2012, just 12 years after this picture, you can see the amount of water that has been diverted from the Aral Sea for massive irrigation. So fresh water was needed to increase agricultural production. And people thought, well, look, it's huge, this lake. We'll just take the water, we'll divert the water flow that's going into the lake onto the fields. And, gut feeling is, how could that possibly cause a problem? And that's a real problem where there are stranded ships. And indeed, I looked at a picture of this 2 days ago. That doesn't exist anymore, that piece of isolated water. So it's just and these are reduced on the periphery. So this is what happens if you don't ask for evidence before you implement policy. You can distort evidence as well. And so here is an example. This is almost 32,000 American scientists signed this petition, including 9,000 who were educated to PhD level. And basically what they're saying is that we should ignore all that nonsense that people are coming up with about human contribution to climate change on our planet, because it will destroy our economy and everything else. And here's somebody with PhD in physics who's quite happy to sign this petition. Now, if I ask you to consider in your own mind, would you say, or would you think, I'm not going to ask you to vote, but would you think that generally that we would say that there is a scientific consensus that humans are having a negative impact on our climate? The climate is warming. And if I think about that question, I'd say, well, yeah, I think there is a scientific consensus. But this has been used to say, well, there is no consensus. Now, let me give you another example of no apparent consensus. So here's this one. Don't worry about this at the moment. There's a statement that there is no scientific consensus on the safety of genetically modified organisms, because 313, not 32,000, but 313 people have signed a petition to say that they don't think it's safe. And that was as of January 2015, and you can look at the signatories on the website. Some of them are scientists. And they say there's no consensus because 313 people have said they don't think it is safe. But what's interesting is that the same people who've signed this think there is a consensus on climate change, and that the 32,000, well, they've got some other thing that's going on that makes them want to sign a petition like that. They're not looking at the scientific evidence properly. So even among scientists, but especially elsewhere, people are quite happy to distort and misuse evidence. What this is, and you won't be able to look at all of this, but these are global scientific academies, institutes, institutions very highly regarded, with no vested interest of people who've all produced reports to say that GMOs are safe. So I would say there is a scientific consensus. So we can misuse evidence. So, scientists, where is our role in all of this? We should try and ensure that policies are more evidence-based. So we're a bit like, and actually I think you more than anyone else are like what I would regard as the universal translator. So here's the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Babelfish, which is the universal translator. You pop it in your ear and you can understand anyone. He also said he thought it was the thing that had caused more death, doom, and destruction in the whole universe, because when people actually understand each other, wars start. So I'm not sure about that. Anyway, so we need to translate. How do we ensure that evidence then matters? We need to communicate what we do and why, and we need to do it tirelessly, and we need to do it where it's difficult, i.e. not with your colleagues, but with people who don't have your sophisticated knowledge. We need to demonstrate the relevance of what we do to a very broad audience. We need to speak to the media, because we need to inform journalists, and we're very lucky in the UK to have the Science Media Centre based in London, who are happy to hear from any of you if you wish to get in touch with them and offer your services as an expert or someone who's willing to make a commentary on the misuse of statistics in the media. And my goodness, you'd be busy if you commented about every time that happened. We do need to speak to policymakers and politicians, the public, of course, non-governmental organizations who often are like the unelected voice of citizens, but they really need to know what the evidence is. So we need to speak. And we need to be honest when we speak. So we need to say where we really don't know. We shouldn't be expected to know everything. So taking a shot in the dark to, really, I'm pretty much certain about this. Trust me, I'm a statistician, that sort of thing. We also need to show empathy for public concerns, because the public feel very worried about a lot of my own research, microbiological research. They do feel worried about genetically modified foods. What could it be doing to me or the environment? And we can't dismiss that and say, but there's a scientific consensus in safety. We need to talk and explain and understand what we do. They can still decide to reject it, which is perfectly reasonable, but they should at least have all of the information. We need to offer options. So as scientists, we need to say, global warming is happening. One of the impacts is fossil fuel emissions into our atmosphere. How can we address this? And it's not for the unelected scientists to say what the policy should be, but we can go some way in offering different options, using less energy, renewables, nuclear, whatever it might be. We can offer the options, but at the end of the day, the policymaker and politician will decide what to do. We need to raise our voice when evidence is being misused. So just, I think this is my favorite publication again, but if we look at global warming stopped 16 years ago, this is what they were looking at against a background of that. Makes good front page copy. It's a complete misuse of evidence. If you don't act, who will? And acting together, we can do things. And I like to come back to this as we identified that chlorofluorocarbons, often used in aerosol propellants and various other like air conditioning systems and so on, caused a hole in the ozone layer, and we saw an increase particularly in skin cancer in the southern hemisphere and elsewhere. We identified the problem, why it was happening. We got together, there was a consensus, there was a protocol, everyone signed up to it, and we are now repairing this hole in the ozone layer, and it will probably be repaired maybe by the end of this century, maybe a little longer. But that in itself should make us think that it takes a very short time of human activity to make an awful lot of damage, and it takes rather a long time for a repair to be effected. And the other thing that I think, and I'm going to close on this, that is really important, is that we should all challenge and ask politicians to be very transparent about when they don't use the evidence. Okay, so if they choose to ignore the scientific evidence, they need to be held to account of why they ignore it. The reason being, it costs a huge amount of money to generate that evidence. We all pay for it as taxpayers. And for us just to ignore that credible evidence, there needs to be a very strong justification. Now, I can give you just one brief example of where it's reasonable to do that. So I was on an expert committee looking at how would you deal with a white powder incident in the London Underground. And we took a lot of evidence from scientists, technologists, security services and so on. And without doubt, the best way to minimize any casualty and to minimize risk was, as soon as there was a white powder incident, seal off the tube. And if they're down there and it's nasty, they will die. Is that the policy? No, it's not the policy. Because we're human, and most of it would find it completely unacceptable. So we would rather take some risk in minimizing what the impact would be if we try to bring people up in a controlled way from the underground. So there's an example of why you might choose to ignore the evidence. Quite a reasonable one, I think. But the point is, if you do ignore the evidence, we need to ask why. There's a lot of us, you'll find yourself somewhere around there, who provides evidence. And it's a very powerful voice if we continue to speak, to challenge, to query, to ask. And it's well worthwhile doing because we all benefit from it. As I said, it takes an awful lot of effort to generate evidence, so we need to make best use of it. Thank you for your time.